The drawings that left Alvis Limited's works on Holyhead Road, Coventry, in 1947 described one chassis and two vehicles. The FV600 series was to be a six-wheeled family sharing a hull, a Rolls-Royce B80 petrol engine, and independent suspension on all six stations, an armoured personnel carrier designated FV603, and an armoured car with a turret and a gun, designated FV601. Britain, 3 years out of a war it had won and could not afford, had decided that its next generation of reconnaissance armour would run on rubber rather than track. The reasoning was budgetary before it was tactical. Clement Attlee's government was managing a dollar crisis, rationing that would outlast the war by 9 years, and an army committed to Palestine, Germany, Malaya, and a dozen garrisons in between. Tracks wore out. Tracks needed transporters. A wheeled car could drive 400 kilometers on a metalled road, arrive with its crew rested, and be maintained by a REME fitter with a spanner rather than a workshop. For an empire in retreat that still had to police the ground it was retreating across, the armoured car was the correct answer to a question about money. Malaya reordered the priorities. The emergency was declared in June 1948, and by 1950 the War Office needed protected transport for infantry, moving along jungle roads far more urgently than it needed a gun car. The FV603 was pushed to the front of the queue, named Saracen, and rushed into production from 1952. Saladin waited. Its turret, its 76mm gun, and its three-man crew sat in the drawing office at Coventry, while the Saracen went east and earned its reputation, ferrying men who had learned to expect a burst of Bren fire from a rubber plantation. 10 years passed between requirement and issue. The Saladin FV601C entered British service in 1958, mounting the 76mm L5 gun, 42 rounds of ammunition, a coaxial Browning, and armour running from roughly 8 to 32mm. It weighed a little under 12 tons. It managed 45 miles an hour on a road. Its designers gave it a party trick that mattered more than any of that. With one wheel station shot away, the remaining 5 could still drive it home. Whitehall did not think of the vehicle as a Cold War instrument. The Royal Armoured Corps thought of it as the successor to the Daimlers and AECs that had worked the Western Desert, and to the armoured car regiments that had spent the late 1940s in Palestine until the mandate ended in May 1948, then Kenya from 1952, then Cyprus from 1955. The Foreign Office thought of it as something to be seen in a capital city. The Treasury thought of it as cheap. Duncan Sandys nearly killed it. The Defence White Paper of April 1957 argued that manned aircraft and conventional forces were being overtaken by missiles, cut the Army's strength by more than a third, and ended national service. Programs died across the board. The Saladin survived the cull because it was already paid for, already tooled, and because the men writing the requirement could point at a map of the Persian Gulf and ask what else was supposed to go there. While the first Saladins were being issued to regiments in Germany and Aden, the United States Army had removed the armoured car from its order of battle altogether. The M8 Greyhound had been struck off. No replacement had been authorized. The Americans had concluded formally and on paper that wheels had no future in armoured reconnaissance, and they had spent the previous decade building the vehicles that were supposed to prove it. Ford's Chicago plant had turned out more than 8,000 M8 Greyhounds by 1945, and the six-wheeled armoured car had done everything the US Army asked of it in France and Germany. In Korea it did rather less, because Korea had no road network worth the name, and the M8's thin belly hull was an invitation to a mine. By the mid-1950s the type was gone from American service, passed to Allies, and unmoored by the armour branch at Fort Knox. Doctrine had moved. The American view, hardened by Aden and by the study groups of the early 1950s, held that reconnaissance meant fighting for information, that fighting meant tracks and armour, and that a wheeled vehicle with 30mm of plate was a liability pretending to be an asset. The M41 Walker Bulldog entered service in 1951 as a light tank with a 76mm gun and 23 tons of weight. Nearly twice the Saladin's, doing broadly the same job. The M56 Scorpion of 1953 mounted a 90mm gun on an airborne chassis with no armour at all. The crew sat in the open behind the gun shield and were expected to be quick. Britain and America were not guessing about each other's kit. The Basic Standardization Agreement signed in 1947 by the American, British and Canadian armies, ABCA, with Australia joining formally in 1963, created a permanent machinery for exchanging equipment, trial reports and design data. British vehicles went to Aden Proving Ground in Maryland. American vehicles came to the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment at Chertsey in Surrey, and to the ranges at Kirkcudbright and Lulworth. Each army read the other's failures in some detail, which is why the failures are so well recorded. The M114 was the one that hurt. Introduced in 1962 as the command and reconnaissance carrier, it was small, aluminium-hulled, tracked, armed with a .50 caliber Browning, and built in numbers approaching 4,000. It was also underpowered, prone to bogging in exactly the soft ground it was supposed to cross, and mounted a weapon its commander had to expose himself to fire. Crews in Vietnam disliked it immediately. The army pulled it out of theatre and began writing it out of the force structure within a decade of buying it. Set against that, the Saladin's virtues were unglamorous and durable. Its gun was a rifled 76mm firing a British invention, high-explosive squash head, a plastic explosive round that flattened against armour, and detached a scab of steel from the inside face. HESH was inaccurate at long range compared with a solid shot, but it worked against bunkers, walls, trucks and lightly protected vehicles, which described almost every target a British armoured car actually encountered between 1958 and 1975. Cost is the comparison nobody in Whitehall wanted to make out loud because it flattered Britain in a decade when very little did. The Saladin was a modestly engineered vehicle assembled by a company better known for sports cars, using an engine derived from a commercial Rolls-Royce unit, in a factory that had been bombed flat in November 1940 and rebuilt. It did not require a new production line, a new power pack, or a new proving program. The Americans, working from a far larger industrial base, were about to embark on the most expensive sequence of light armour failures in NATO's history. The first Saladins reached the Aden Protectorate before the decade ended. Within 6 years they would be firing in anger up a road that the Royal Air Force had been bombing since the 1920s. British Army of the Rhine had a specific problem that shaped how the Saladin was used. The armoured car regiments Screening 1 BR Corps in Westphalia were expected to find the leading elements of Third Shock Army, report their axis, and survive long enough to report it twice. Speed and radio mattered more than protection. A Saladin squadron could cover a corps frontage on the North German plain at road speed, sit hull down in a tree line, and use the 76mm to break up a reconnaissance patrol rather than fight a tank. Regiments took to it. The 11th Hussars, the Royal Scots Greys, the 16th/5th Lancers, and the successive armoured car units of the Royal Armoured Corps ran Saladins alongside ferrets in Germany, Cyprus, Aden, and the Gulf. Crew of 3, commander, gunner, driver, meant a troop of 4 cars put 12 men on the ground, which suited an army whose manpower was falling every year after national service ended in 1960, and the final conscripts were discharged in 1963. Then came the export business, and this is where the story turns from a vehicle into a policy. Britain's balance of payments crisis under Harold Wilson made arms sales a treasury matter rather than a war office one. Following a review by Sir Donald Stokes of Leyland, the Defence Sales Organisation was established in 1966 under Dennis Healey as Secretary of State for Defence, with Raymond Brown as the first head of defence sales. Its remit was blunt: sell British military equipment abroad systematically with government backing. The Saladin was almost purpose-built for that remit. It was cheap to buy, cheap to run, needed no rail infrastructure, and looked exactly like what a newly independent state wanted, parked outside its Ministry of the Interior. Kuwait bought it, Jordan bought it, Oman, Bahrain, Qatar, Abu Dhabi, Libya, Lebanon, Sudan, Nigeria, Ghana, Uganda, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Portugal and Honduras bought it. West Germany's Bundesgrenzschutz, a NATO ally with the American arms industry on its doorstep, and American divisions on its soil, bought British. Production ran to somewhere a little over 1,100 vehicles, the majority for export rather than for the British Army. That ratio is the point. The Saladin was one of the few pieces of British defence engineering in the 1960s that made money at a time when the aircraft cancellations of 1965, TSR-2 in April, then P-1154 and HS-681, had convinced a good deal of Whitehall that Britain could no longer build advanced military equipment at all. Healy's arithmetic was cold and correct. Every Saladin sold to a Gulf ruler was hard currency, a training team, a spares contract lasting 20 years, and a British officer somewhere in the loop. It was influence purchased at a discount by a country that could no longer purchase it any other way, and it was running at precisely the moment the government was preparing to announce, in January 1968, that Britain would withdraw from east of Suez by the end of 1971. The vehicles stayed after the garrisons left. In September 1970, Jordanian armour bought from Britain would be the thing standing between King Hussein and a Syrian armoured brigade. And by then the Saladin had already been shot at, hard in the mountains north of Aden. The Radfan is a mass of granite ridges, roughly 60 miles north of Aden, cut by wadis, held in 1963 by tribesmen with Lee Enfields, and increasingly weapons supplied through the Yemen. Operation Nutcracker opened in January 1964, with the Federal Regular Army and British units pushing into the hills. What followed through April, May and June was the largest ground operation the British Army fought between Suez and the Falklands, involving 45 commando, 3 para, elements of 22 SAS, and armoured cars working the few tracks a vehicle could use at all. Saladins did what wheeled cars do in mountains. They held the road. The Dala Road running north from Aden towards the frontier was the artery for everything. Supply, casualty evacuation, relief of forward positions, and it was ambushed continuously. A Saladin's 76mm firing HESH into a sangar on a ridgeline at 800 meters was the fastest available answer to a machine gun the infantry could not reach. Crews learned that the vehicle's high silhouette was a liability and its road speed was salvation, and that a punctured run-flat tire would still carry them out of a killing area. Borneo tested the opposite conditions. During confrontation with Indonesia from 1963 to 1966, Saladins found little use in primary jungle, where the war was fought by companies on foot and by helicopter, but they secured airstrips and base perimeters at Kuching and elsewhere. General Sir Walter Walker's campaign was an infantry and intelligence war. The armoured car was a static insurance policy, and the army was content to use it as one. Cyprus put the vehicle under a different flag entirely. When intercommunal fighting broke out at Christmas 1963, British troops on the island were placed between the communities, and in March 1964, the United Nations Security Council established UNFICYP. British Saladins were repainted white with UN markings and used to interpose along the Green Line in Nicosia, a gun vehicle deployed explicitly not to fire, which is a harder tactical problem than it sounds, and one the British Army had by then rehearsed for 15 years. Jordan produced the sharpest test. During the crisis of September 1970, as King Hussein moved against the Palestinian Fedayeen organizations, a Syrian armoured force crossed the northern frontier towards Irbid and Ramtha. Jordanian armour, Centurions and British-supplied armoured cars fought a two-day action from September 20th to September 22nd, supported by the Royal Jordanian Air Force, and the Syrian column withdrew. Whitehall watched with acute interest because Jordan's order of battle was substantially British and its officer corps substantially British trained. Oman ran Saladin's hardest of all. The Sultan's armed forces, commanded and staffed in significant part by seconded and contract British officers, fought the Dhofar Rebellion from 1965 until 1976. And the campaign that followed Qaboos's accession in July 1970 was directed by a small British apparatus that included 22 SAS training teams and an intelligence effort coordinated back to London. Armoured cars escorted convoys up the escarpment and covered positions on the Salalah plain, in heat that killed engines and men. Across the same decade, the United States Army was fighting a war in which convoys were ambushed daily on roads it could not secure, and discovering it had nothing wheeled, armoured and armed to escort them with. Highway 19 between Chinon and Pleiku was the sort of road British armoured car crews would have recognised instantly. A single metalled route through broken country, mined at night, ambushed by day, and absolutely essential to everyone using it. The US Army had M113 armoured personnel carriers and gun trucks improvised from 5-ton cargo lorries with sandbags and quad .5s bolted into the beds. What it did not have was a purpose-built wheeled gun vehicle. Cadillac Gage had built one anyway, privately without a US Army requirement. The V-100 Commando was a 4x4 armoured car developed with export sales in mind, and when American forces in Vietnam needed convoy escorts and base security vehicles, they bought it. Designated M706 or X-M706 in service, issued to Air Force Security Police, guarding airfields, and to Army military police. A commercial product filled a doctrinal hole that the world's largest defence establishment had spent 15 years insisting did not exist. The M551, Sheridan, was the other half of the story. Development had begun in 1959 for an armoured reconnaissance/airborne assault vehicle. Aluminium hull, airdroppable and armed with a 152mm gun/launcher, firing both conventional rounds and the Shillelagh guided missile. It was an ambitious weapon system on a light chassis, and the ambition was concentrated almost entirely in the ammunition, which used a combustible cartridge case that left burning residue in the breech and required a compressed air scavenging system to clear it. Sheridans reached Vietnam in January 1969 with the 3rd Squadron, 4th Cavalry, and the 11th Armoured Cavalry Regiment. Crews reported misfires, fumes, electronics disturbed by the gun's recoil, and combustible cases degrading in the humidity. The missile system, the vehicle's expensive reason for existing, was essentially unusable in the war being fought. The 152mm canister round, firing thousands of flechettes, was liked. Almost nothing else was. Around 1,600 Sheridans had been built, and the Army began removing them from most units within a decade. The contrast with the Saladin is not a matter of national pride, but of engineering ambition. Alvis had put a brass-cased 76mm firing squash head and canister into a turret on a lorry chassis, and had asked nothing further of the technology. The Americans had attempted to leap a generation, and the leap had landed in a rice paddy. Britain watched from a deliberate distance. Harold Wilson refused repeated American requests for a British military contribution to Vietnam, including in his exchanges with Lyndon Johnson during 1965 and 1966. A refusal that cost the relationship real warmth and that Wilson considered unavoidable given his party, his majority, and the state of the pound. British involvement was instead advisory and analytical. Robert Thompson's British Advisory Mission to Vietnam, established in 1961 and drawing directly on the Malayan emergency, argued for police primacy, population control, and patient intelligence work rather than firepower. Whitehall's assessments circulating through the Joint Intelligence Committee and the Foreign Office were consistently more pessimistic about American prospects than Washington's own. The judgment was not that American soldiers were poor. It was that the American system procured equipment and designed campaigns for a war it wanted, rather than the war in front of it. And the Sheridan sitting immobilized on Highway 13 with a fouled breech was the argument in physical form. The genuine embarrassment, however, was not happening in Vietnam. It was happening at Watervliet Arsenal in New York State, where the United States was manufacturing a British gun under license and putting it in its main battle tank. The L-7 was designed at the Royal Ordnance Factory in the mid-1950s after British examination of a Soviet T-54. The tank driven into the British Embassy grounds in Budapest during the Hungarian Rising of November 1956 is the version usually told, and historians differ on how much that specific vehicle contributed. What is not in dispute is the result: a 105mm rifled gun, compact enough to fit existing turret rings, accurate and capable of defeating any Soviet armour then fielded. Britain fitted it to the Centurion. Then the Americans tested it, evaluated it against their own 90mm and 105mm candidates, and adopted it. Produced under license as the M68, manufactured at Watervliet Arsenal, it armed the M60 from 1960 through every variant of that tank's long life. And it armed the M1 Abrams when that vehicle entered service in 1980. West Germany fitted it to the Leopard 1. Israel, Sweden, Switzerland, Japan, and a dozen others followed. The standard NATO tank gun for a generation was British. The ammunition followed the gun. HESH, developed in Britain from wartime work on demolition rounds, was adopted by the US Army under the designation HEP, High Explosive Plastic, and issued as the M393 series for the M68. American tank crews in the 1960s were firing a British gun with a British round at targets identified by doctrine written in Fort Knox, and almost nobody outside the ordnance community noticed. Chieftain compounded the point. Entering British service in 1966, it carried a 120mm rifled L11 gun with separated ammunition and bagged charges, the heaviest main armament on any NATO tank, married to steeply sloped armour, and a driver who lay almost supine to keep the hull low. It was underpowered. The L-60 engine was a genuine and persistent failure that MOD spent 2 decades trying to fix. But its gun and its protection were ahead of anything the Americans or West Germans had fielded. MBT-70 was supposed to answer it. Launched in 1963 as a joint United States and West German program, it was to produce a common tank with a hydropneumatic suspension, a 152mm gun/launcher, and the driver seated in the turret. Costs rose. The two armies disagreed about metric and imperial measurement, about the gun, about the engine, and about almost everything else. And the program was terminated in 1970 after expenditure of something on the order of $300 million. The American-only successor, XM-803, was cancelled by Congress in December 1971. Whitehall drew the obvious conclusion and did not say it loudly. British defence procurement in the 1960s was a chronicle of cancellations. TSR-2, CVA-01, the 5th Polaris boat. And the Ministry of Defence created in 1964 under Healy was designed largely to stop that happening again. Yet on armour specifically, the record ran the other way. Britain fielded Chieftain while its principal ally cancelled 2 consecutive tank programmes and had to rearm its existing fleet with a British gun. Healy announced the withdrawal from east of Suez in January 1968, closing the strategic account that the Saladin had been built to service. The vehicles remained in the Gulf. The regiments came home, and at a research establishment on the Surrey heathland, a team was assembling laminated blocks of ceramic and steel that would matter more to the Pentagon than any armoured car ever could. The Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment sat at Chertsey, with associated work at Chobham Common, and by the late 1960s its scientists had produced a form of composite armour built from ceramic elements bonded within a metal matrix. Against a shaped charge warhead, the anti-tank weapon proliferating fastest through the Warsaw Pact, it was dramatically more effective than the equivalent weight of rolled homogeneous steel. It took the name of the common, Chobham. Britain disclosed it to the Americans. The technical exchange proceeded through the early 1970s with US delegations viewing the material and its test results, and the effect on the American tank program was immediate and structural. The XM1 designs then being developed by Chrysler and General Motors were reworked to incorporate special armour derived from the British work, and the M1 Abrams that emerged in 1980 owed its survivability to a British laboratory. Britain applied the same technology to its own Challenger, which entered service in 1983. Governments do not hand over that kind of advantage from generosity. The disclosure ran alongside a sustained British effort, under Edward Heath's government from 1970 and Harold Wilson's from 1974, to keep the United Kingdom inside the American technological orbit at a moment when Britain was entering the European Economic Community, running an inflation rate above 20%, and heading towards the IMF loan of 1976. Technical intimacy was a currency Britain still possessed when it possessed almost nothing else. The aircraft told the same story. The Harrier, developed by Hawker Siddeley from the P.1127 and the first operational vertical takeoff combat aircraft in the world, was ordered by the United States Marine Corps as the AV-8A, with deliveries from 1971 and around 110 aircraft acquired. The Marines had watched British trials, concluded the concept worked, and bought foreign because nothing American did the job. McDonnell Douglas later built the AV-8B under a transatlantic arrangement, but the aeroplane was British in origin, and everyone involved knew it. Artillery closed the pattern. The L118 105mm light gun, designed at the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment and entering British service in 1976, was evaluated by the US Army and selected in the 1980s as its replacement towed howitzer, entering American service as the M119. British gun, American designation, American license production. The same sequence as the L7, run again 25 years later. 4 times across the Cold War then, the United States armed itself with British designs after testing them. The tank gun, the tank armour, the vertical takeoff strike aircraft, the light howitzer. None of these episodes was framed publicly as a humiliation, because both governments had every interest in framing them as alliance cooperation, which is also what they were. But the pattern is unambiguous in the record, and the Pentagon's own procurement histories do not hide it. The Saladin belongs to that pattern by adjacency rather than by adoption. No American army bought it. What the Americans could not do was field an equivalent, and their attempts to do without one. The M114, the Sheridan, the improvised gun trucks, the off-the-shelf Commando, cost more and delivered less than a Coventry car firm's six-wheeler that had been designed in the year of the dollar crisis. By 1982, the United States Marine Corps was finally buying a wheeled armoured vehicle, and it still was not an American design. The light armoured vehicle competition ran in 1981 and 1982, with trials at 29 Palms and Aberdeen, and the candidates included Cadillac Gage's V300 and an 8-wheeled design from the Swiss firm MOWAG offered through the diesel division of General Motors of Canada. The Canadian-built Piranha 1 entering Marine Corps service as the LAV-25. The US Army, which had joined the program, withdrew from it in 1984 as congressional funding fell away. 39 years after retiring the M8 Greyhound, the American ground forces acquired a wheeled armoured vehicle, Swiss in design, Canadian in manufacture. Britain had meanwhile replaced the Saladin twice over. The Fox F-5 721 arrived from 1973 with a 30mm Raden cannon and an aluminium hull. and the Scorpion family of tracked reconnaissance vehicles entered service the same year, weighing under 8 tons and exported to more than 15 countries. Alvis, which had begun the FV-600 drawings in 1947, was still selling reconnaissance armour to the world in the 1980s. Saladins soldiered on abroad long after they left British regiments. Indonesian vehicles remained in service. Omani and Gulf cars stayed on strength through the 1970s. Sri Lankan Saladins were used during the insurgencies of the 1970s and 1980s. Vehicles built in Coventry in the early 1960s were being maintained by armies that had been colonies when the first prototypes ran. Kuwait's were still there on August 2nd, 1990. When Iraqi armour crossed the border before dawn, the Kuwaiti 35th Armoured Brigade fought a delaying action west of Kuwait City that became known as the Battle of the Bridges, using chieftains bought from Britain, and lost the country in a day, but not without cost to the attackers. British supplied armour sold through the defence sales organisation that Healey had created in 1966 to earn foreign exchange was the first thing to shoot back. Britain's response was Operation Granby, the largest British deployment since Suez. 7th Armoured Brigade sailed in September 1990, joined by 4th Armoured Brigade, to form the 1st Armoured Division under Major General Rupert Smith, with 176 Challenger 1 tanks. Margaret Thatcher, who had told George Bush at Aspen on August 2nd that this was no time to go wobbly, was out of office by November 28th, and it was John Major's government that took the division into Iraq on February 24th, 1991. The ground war lasted 100 hours. Challenger 1 squadrons of the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, the Queen's Royal Irish Hussars and the 14th/20th King's Hussars destroyed Iraqi armour across the Wadi al-Batin without losing a single tank to enemy fire, including one engagement in which a Challenger destroyed a dug-in Iraqi tank at a range subsequently reported at over 4,700 metres. Chobham armour, developed at Chertsey and given to the Americans 2 decades earlier, was doing what its designers had promised. The Cold War ended 9 months after the ceasefire, when the Soviet Union dissolved on December 26, 1991. Britain had spent 46 years unable to afford the forces its commitments demanded, and had compensated with engineering. With a gun the Americans licensed, an armour the Americans adopted, an aircraft the Americans bought, and a 6-wheeled car built by a sports car firm that outlasted 3 generations of better-funded American light armour. What the Pentagon found testing British equipment through 40 years of ABCA exchange was not a scandal. It was a recurring and inconvenient verdict that the ally with the smallest budget kept arriving at the better answer first.